We're going to be reading today from Jane Austen's Sense and Sensibility, which a lot of people think is all about love and marriage, but it turns out is really about money. Chapter 1. The family of Dashwood had long been settled in Sussex. Their estate was large, and their residence was at Norland Park in the center of their property, where for many generations they had lived in so respectable a manner as to engage the general good opinion of their surrounding acquaintance. So that means this family lived in a grand manor house or a mansion surrounded by a huge park-like estate. The late owner of this estate was a single man who lived to a very advanced age, and who, for many years of his life, had a constant companion and housekeeper in his sister. But her death, which happened 10 years before his own, produced a great alteration in his home, for to supply her loss, he invited and received into his house the family of his nephew, Mr. Henry Dashwood, the legal inheritor of the Norland estate, and the person to whom he intended to bequeath it. In the society of his nephew and niece, and their children, the old gentleman's days were comfortably spent. His attachment to them all increased. The constant attention of Mr. and Mrs. Henry Dashwood to his wishes, which proceeded not merely from interest, but from goodness of heart, gave him every degree of solid comfort which his age could receive, and the cheerfulness of the children added a relish to his existence. So generally what that means is that this old man is pretty grateful to this family for moving in with him and taking care of him and being a family to him in his old age. By a former marriage, Mr. Henry Dashwood had one son. By his present lady, that is, by his present wife, 3 daughters. The son, a steady, respectable young man, was amply provided for by the fortune of his mother, which had been large, and half of which devolved on him on his coming of age. So there's this old man, and he is the owner of Norland Manor. And he lives there with his sister, who helps him take care of the house. But then she dies, and when she dies, he invites his nephew to come live with him, and his nephew's wife, and the nephew's name is Mr. Henry Dashwood. Now, Mr. Henry Dashwood was married before, and his late wife had a ton of money. This old man who owns Norland Manor also has a ton of money. Now, when this wife died, half of that money went to the kid that the two of them had together. And that kid's name is Mr. John Dashwood. By his own marriage, likewise, which happened soon afterwards, he added to his wealth. To him, therefore, the succession to the Norland estate was not so really important as to his sisters, for their fortune, independent of what might arise to them from their fathers inheriting that property, could be but small. Their mother had nothing, and their father only £7,000 in his own disposal, for the remaining moiety of his first wife's fortune was also secured to her child, and he had only a life interest in it. So the upshot is their stepbrother is going to be rolling in money, whereas the stepsisters, unless they inherit money from the old man, are going to be living in relative poverty. The old gentleman died. His will was read, and like almost every other will, gave as much disappointment as pleasure. He was neither so unjust nor so ungrateful as to leave his estate from his nephew, but he left it to him on such terms as destroyed half the value of the bequest. Mr. Dashwood had wished for it more for the sake of his wife and daughters than for himself or his son, but to his son and his son's son, a child of 4 years old, it was secured, in such a way as to leave to himself no power of providing for those who were most dear to him and who most needed a provision by any charge on the estate or by any sale of its valuable woods. The whole was tied up for the benefit of this child, who, in occasional visits with his father and mother at Norland, had so far gained on the affections of his uncle, by such attractions as are by no means unusual in children of 2 or 3 years old, an imperfect articulation, an earnest desire of having his own way, many cunning tricks, and a great deal of noise, as to outweigh all the value of all the attention which for years he had received from his niece and her daughters. He meant not to be unkind, however, and as a mark of his affection for the 3 girls, he left them £1,000 apiece. So there's this expectation that when the old man dies, he's going to leave his estate to his nephew and his nephew's family. But it turns out that the women don't inherit any money at all, or only very little, and instead the whole estate and almost all of the money winds up going to the older son, John Dashwood. Mr. Dashwood's disappointment was at first severe, but his temper was cheerful and sanguine, and he might reasonably hope to live many years, and by living economically, lay by, that means to save up, a considerable sum from the produce of an estate already large and capable of almost immediate improvement. But the fortune, which had been so tardy in coming, was his only 1 12-month. That means that he had the estate for only a year. He survived his uncle no longer, and £10,000, including the late legacies, was all that remained for his widow and daughters. It's not too hard to guess what happens in the rest of the chapter. Mrs. John Dashwood, the wife of the stepbrother, decides that they really can't afford to share any of their inheritance with the Dashwood sisters. John Dashwood pockets the entire inheritance, and the widow and her family are forced to leave Norland Manor and to find some place that they can afford to live. As you read the rest of this chapter, what I really want you to think about is how strange it is that a story that is supposedly about love and marriage would begin with all of this talk about money and inheritance. What is it exactly about romantic love and marriage that Jane Austen is trying to convey to us? And what kind of questions does she want us to ask about the position of women in a society where women can't have jobs or earn money of their own?